Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. In the last 1200 years, Ireland has had a lot of unwelcome visitors. The Vikings, the English, the French, the Spanish even sent an armada. And these were not welcome guests, but they helped carve the country, the history just oozing out of the rocks and the structures. And it also helped create the personal stories and the folklore that you'll hear in the pubs, you'll hear on the roadside from the elders. Today I want to take you on a journey. And this journey starts over here. It starts on my honeymoon night, and it's going to end up where we get to stare face to face with the Vikings. My honeymoon night, I'm on an aeroplane. I got married in Toronto, Canada, and we were flying over to Ireland to arrive in Belfast, Ireland, late at night. And Ireland in the 80s, it was still a war zone. There was still a lot of conflict going on between the English and the Irish. We'd flown into Belfast because the day I got married is the day I gave up my career. I didn't want to be working on ships anymore. I wanted to find a new career, so I was basically unemployed. And the $100 cheaper flights into Belfast seemed to be worth it. So we're driving down in the countryside towards the border to get into Southern Ireland. And it's still bandit country there, lots of British soldiers. And as you're approaching the border, about a mile from the border, they tell you to turn off your lights. And then suddenly there's spotlights shining on your car, and they've got audio devices where they can actually listen to what you're saying, and you proceed at about 3 miles an hour towards the border. We arrived at the border. There was a young British soldier there. We wound down the window. He says, "How are you doing, sir? What are you up to? Where are you going to?" And I said, "Sir, I'm here on my honeymoon with my nice Canadian bride here." And he says, "Oh, that's great." And no sooner had he said the word great, suddenly the sky exploded with light. Helicopters started landing. Soldiers wearing bushes ran out of the helicopters, jumped into the bushes, and out of the bushes came other soldiers jumping onto the helicopters. And within 30 seconds, it was quiet again. I said to the soldier, "Is there something wrong?" And he was saying, No, they're just changing shift." First night of my honeymoon. My wife still remembers this. We traveled down the road, and the next day we're in the pristine countryside on the southwest coast of Ireland. And I want to bring my wife to the most special place in the country. It's a place that the tourist buses won't bring you. You won't find it unless you really know where to go, and it's really difficult to get to. It's an island called Skellig Michael, and it's 10 miles off the shore. And at that time, the only way to get there was on a fishing boat. And there were several companies down there. The group I went with was a guy who owned the boat, was called Joe Roddy, and I'll never forget his name, and we'll discover that later on. So we're going through this horrible journey. There's people getting sick on the boat. It's the Atlantic, and it's a very cruel environment. But after about 3 hours traveling, what do we end up seeing in the distance? What you might think looks like Jurassic Park. Basically a mountain coming out of the ocean. And on the top of this very island, up here, are beehive huts. And these were inhabited by the monks 1,000 years ago. And the history books talk about the Vikings attacking the monks back in 821. That's 1,200 years ago. And we walked up this winding path full of old shale, rocks falling away from your feet, puffin birds actually at your feet in these little holes, just looking out, wondering, is there any danger coming? And we worked our way up. It takes about an hour and a half going up these little roads to get up to where these beehive huts are. And as you're going up there, you pass through a little gap in the rocks, and it's called the Needle. And that is the area that ends up at these beehive huts. And to show you what these beehive huts look like, And these are perfectly preserved from 1,000 years ago, so you can imagine how well constructed they were. So if you look at the ruggedness of the island and you look at where they actually had this placed, it was up and around this area. And the monks chose a very, very good area, because when the Vikings were attacking them, what they ended up having to do was to actually walk through this needle. And up on top, the history books, and these aren't just history books, these are actually, the great thing about Ireland is that they kept journals. And these journals are still alive now, where they talked about what happened every year. And they actually talked about waking up one morning and seeing the Viking ships approaching. And the Viking ships had already attacked some of the other islands. And basically they were looking for any gold or things that the church people might have had hidden for safety there. So the monks are up on top, they're looking down, they see this boat approaching, and then they start seeing the Vikings slowly working their way up towards them. And this group of people, they had very little time to react, but what they started doing was gathering rocks, big boulders, and they stood up on the top just above a high level, approaching where the needle was, and anytime the Vikings would start coming towards them, they would roll these big rocks down there and knock the Vikings off their feet. The history books tell that the monks survived except for one. One guy was captured, and they think that he was probably captured to be held ransom. But this was just a very unusual occurrence in Ireland. You know, Ireland has, over the years, has been attacked by the French. They brought their big armadas. The Spanish brought their armadas. But these were Viking boats on their own, just coming along and basically looking to rob the treasures from the monks. And when I was up there with my wife, I remember just sitting up on a rock, looking down at the needle, and you were literally standing in the same area that the monks would have been standing over 1,000 years ago or 1,200 years ago, panic-stricken and rolling rocks down at these warriors that were trying to attract them. So, you know, I look at Ireland and it's had unwanted visitors over the year, but when you go visit these places, you visit the monuments, you visit the islands, you talk to the people, everything starts to come alive to where you can actually visualize what is actually happening in these journals and in their history books. So I talked to you earlier on about this guy called Joe Roddy. And this was the second day of my honeymoon. And my wife and I had spent too long on the island. We've been told that you've got 3 hours to go up there and basically see all the sights, wander around and sit and absorb it in. And when we got back to the little area where the fishing boats, where our fishing boat should have been waiting, we discovered it had gone. They had left without us. This is 10 miles out in the Atlantic. Most of the year you cannot land on the island because it's so rough. The waves are so big that the boats are going up and down and you can't step off safely. Luckily for us, there was another boat visiting that day, and it was leaving as well, and we just managed to shout out to it and get it to come back. And it wasn't even going to the same place that we had left from. It was actually going to another part of the mainland that was about 2 hours away. And one of the things I remember is we got there, we phoned from the pub to Joe Roddy and we said, "Joe, you left us on the island." And he was saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, sure didn't that happen only a month ago?" And, you know, as a risk engineer, I'd say to him, "Come on guys, isn't it time you sort of did a head count?" To finish off my story is, you know, Ireland is a place of stories. It's a place where we've had visitors, we've got history there. I encourage you to go and visit it. And it's also a place where everyone's got their personal stories. And so I've stood up here today. I wanted to give you an insight of who I am and how that I've become part of my own little family history book as well on Toastmasters.